just a minute. And I'm going to also change the view. Okay, so again, we're picking up with chapter 15, beginning with verse 12. And the Torah is going to be talking about slavery, which continues to exist among the Jewish people.
What page are we on?
If you have the Eitz Chaim Chumash, we're on page 1079. 1079. So as I was saying, the institution of slavery does not disappear. God does not outlaw it, which is disturbing in some ways, but it will continue to exist according to rabbinic tradition up until the time of the destruction of the temple. And we're going to talk about why that would be, that it's discontinued with the destruction of the temple in a moment or two. So I want to take note of the fact, the Hebrew here for a moment. Again, in verse 12, chapter 15, Ki yimchar lecha achicha ha'ivri. It says, if your fellow Hebrew, a man or a woman, is sold to you, he will serve for 6 years. So what I want to take note of here is the Hebrew word. It says fellow, but the Hebrew word here is achicha, your brother. Right? In other words, this is not just, the assumption here is that this is not just another member of your people. The emphasis is that you have a familial blood tie with this person. And I want to mention this because in antiquity, and particularly in the Greco-Roman world later on, slaves are not viewed as equal people. They're a sort of lower order of being. And the emphasis here is, this is your brother. And that, of course, has implications if you have a slave, or how you treat that slave. Or you have to see yourself in that slave. You have to think about that slave just as you are, as being created in the image of God. One of the arguments which is made for the historicity of the story of the Exodus, the question is, well, how do we know it happened? And there are no archaeological remains from the Exodus, and there are certainly scholars who would question whether it ever happened. But one of the reasons why some scholars think that it must have happened is that no ancient people would willingly say that they were enslaved. That it is so disgraceful to be a slave that this person is not your brother, not your equal. It's something of a much lower being. At any rate, here this person is referred to as your brother. Somebody keeps coming in and out. I just want to make sure everybody checks to make sure you're muted. That would be a good thing. Anyway, such a person will serve for 6 years, and in the 7th year, they will be set free. So there's a limited term in which someone can be a slave. People were sold into slavery often by themselves because they were impoverished. Therefore, it's the equivalent of being an indentured servant. Sometimes they do it in order to pay off a debt. Sometimes a person owes fines. A thief, for example, has to not only return the property, but has to pay a considerable fine for stealing it. Can't pay the fine. One way to come up with it would be to become someone's indentured servant. The word here is generally is eved, Evid doesn't necessarily mean a slave. It could also be a servant, but this person has been sold to you. In addition to in addition to that, at least according to Exodus, people could indenture their children for a period of time as well. You think about apprenticeship in the medieval period, perhaps looked something like that. It's unclear. We, of course, would find it repellent that someone would do this with their children. Hold on one second. Just give me a minute. I'm gonna mute everybody. Okay, so at any rate, they're set free in the 7th year, and here we have something really quite striking.
Yeah.
Sylvia, you have to mute or not.
I did. I tried to, but it doesn't.
Okay, all right. Don't worry about it. Let me just try this again. Okay, so I wanted to move on to look at the next sentence really here, which is, when you set them free, you should not let him go empty-handed. Furnish him out of the flock and threshing floor and vat with what the Lord your God has blessed you. So this is really quite striking. The idea is this person, because they were impoverished, voluntarily became a slave, and now the time of their slavery is over. And the problem is that they will be just as impoverished. And therefore, even though the person is supposed to be set free after 6 years, they'll just re-enter slavery one more time, right? So the Torah doesn't want that to happen. And it says that the master should provide for the slave so that once the slavery is over, they will be independent and self-sufficient. Now, we don't have an amount here. It simply says, out of your possessions, your flock and your threshing floor and your vat, whatever the Lord has blessed you. So presumably, if you have a lot of money, you give more, and if you don't have much, you give less. Well, the rabbis are disturbed by this because, people need a certain amount. And so they established, the Talmud says this was at least 30 shekels. 30 shekels is what it costs to buy a slave in antiquity. So it's a significant amount of money or grain or produce. And again, we get reiterated here, and it's more often than anything else in the Torah. Bear in mind that you were slaves in the land of Egypt and the Lord redeemed you, right? So you know what it's like. God brought you out, and now you also must care for your slave. Therefore, I enjoin you this commandment. And then we get, well, what if he doesn't want to leave? Things are pretty good. No risk, you have to do what you're told, but you're living a more comfortable life. If the slave should say to you, I don't want to leave you, he loves you and your household and is happy with you. So this is a real change from the book of Exodus. In the book of Exodus, actually, I'm going to turn back to it because it's really quite dramatic. So it's at the beginning of Mishpatim. It's right after the 10 Commandments. All right, bear with me. I think I've got it. Yes. So right after the Ten Commandments, if you have Eitz Chaim and you want to look at it, saving where we are, it's on page 457. It's chapter 21, verse 2 in Exodus. So why is this doing all these things? Okay, so here it says, when you acquire a Hebrew slave, you serve for 6 years. In the 7th year, he shall go free without payment. What we just read was you have to pay him. You have to give him enough that he will be self-sufficient. If he came in single, he'll leave single. If he had a wife, his wife will leave with him. If his master gave him a wife and she has borne him children, his wife and her children shall belong to the master, and he will leave alone. But if the slave declares, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I do not wish to go free, then there's this ritual we're about to read. So this is really striking, right? Because here we have no ideas, no evidence at all that, first of all, here, as we just saw in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 15, verse 14, in the book of Deuteronomy, there it says he doesn't get anything in Exodus. Here, you have to provide for him to be self-sufficient. And here, if he says he loves you and your household and is with happy, then you do the following. Remember in Exodus, he said, I love my wife and my children. Therefore, I want to stay. That's gone, completely gone. And the idea here is that they don't break up the family in Deuteronomy. When the slave has finished, he goes out along with his family. And so this is I think, a very significant change. And I would attribute it to a change in the view of slavery over time, and one which really is far more humane. And I want to come back to the idea that God does not abolish slavery after the giving of the Ten Commandments, but there is a gradual transformation in which I think the people are weaned off of slavery to the extent that it actually becomes abolished. This is similar, I think, to sacrifices, which eventually people are weaned off of and don't have anymore. Capital punishment more or less disappears in the rabbinic period. A whole host of things, which are really the way the Torah views things is not, in most cases, is not revolutionary. It's evolutionary. It is over a course of time, things change. They're not so radical that people won't accept them. There's a statement that it's actually said about Ishmael, who's this child in the wilderness with his mother Hagar, that he's in distress and he cries out, and God hears the cry of the child, Asher Hu Sham, who is there. And the emphasis on why not just he hears the cry of the child? Why does he hears the cry of the child who is there? Asher Hu Sham becomes in Jewish law in general a kind of watchword, which is that things are circumstantial, depending on where people are. And I think the sense in terms of slavery, perhaps, is that the people simply wouldn't abide it. They wouldn't follow it. And so we begin to see limitations on slavery in the book of Exodus. Those limitations are expanded here in the book of Deuteronomy, and eventually slavery disappears completely. So what do you do with this slave? You take an all, I guess that's how you pronounce it, I think so, and pass it through his ears in the doorpost, and then he will be your slave in perpetuity. Right, so there's a ritual. His ear is pierced, and that means that he does not go through voluntarily through his own choice, even though he would have been set up. He simply prefers to remain in this household where he is happy. And note that that's what the Torah said, that he is happy there, wants to stay there. Why the ear? A variety of theories. No one really knows. One is that the ear is where he hears, and he has to hear and obey his master as a slave. There's a lovely rabbinic interpretation that the ear that heard at Sinai, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt to be your God, redeemed you from slavery. That is, that God brought us out so we weren't slaves anymore. That ear that heard that is now voluntarily choosing to be a slave. And so it's a kind of punishment. It's likely that there was probably something placed in this hole in the ear. In fact, it's certain, because otherwise it's just going to close up. And that would be some way of identifying a slave. And then it says, when you set him free, do not feel aggrieved, right? For in 6 years, he has given you double the servitude of a hired man. Presumably, he is your slave day and night, right? And the hired man only working for you during the day. Moreover, the Lord, your God, will bless you. So by doing the right thing, shouldn't feel bad, because when you do the right thing, you'll have blessings from God. And now we're moving on to a different subject. I do want to open things up before we do, in case there are questions or comments about slavery.
Rabbi?
And yes, Saul, go ahead.
Mike?
According to my reading in Hertz, the female slave had to be released. There was no time lapse after 7 years.
Right. So that is rabbinic tradition.
Oh,
It isn't, the text itself doesn't seem to specify that. In fact, it says, do the same with your female slave. Right? So it's right that you must release him, or you'd put the hole in their ear. So I'm not questioning that that's what Hertz says, but Hertz is not reflecting what is the pshat here, the meaning of the text. I also I forgot
Rabbi?
to, yes.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, right. Let me just say something, and then
sure.
I'll come to your question. I forgot to mention, and so let me just say it. He becomes your slave in perpetuity, right? He gets his ear pierced, and then he's your slave in perpetuity. So the question is, what does perpetuity mean? And there are two exceptions. The first is he can't be inherited. He's not really property. And therefore, even if he has now been pierced, he says he wants to stay with you. When the master dies, he goes free. The second thing is the Jubilee year. Every 50 years, a Jubilee is declared after 7 cycles of 7 years. And in the 50th year, all slaves are freed, all land reverts to its original owners. Complicated question, we're not going to talk about it, but that too is an exception. Even this slave who is in perpetuity, and this is actually how far it goes. Let's assume that he sells himself into slavery with the Jubilee year 2 years away. He goes free after 2 years. He doesn't wait the 6 years to go free, because all slaves are freed in the Jubilee year. Good thing, but it's only every 49 years, after every 49 years. Okay, Michael, please.
Okay, going back a little bit, you were talking about in Exodus, it says the wife and children stay with the master, and
Yes.
then they change your philosophy or whatever.
Well, if,
the end
no,
said,
yeah.
okay, go on.
no, I just want to clarify. In Exodus, if he's married when he
Yeah.
comes in, then he goes out with his wife.
But you said the reason that ideas change, but doesn't that go against the fact that Torah was given at one time? I don't
Yes.
know. And
Yes.
why the change? It sounds like it evolved over time. And
Right. So I think the answer is the Torah is not given at one.
so
And
that
in
whole
fact,
thing, how do they explain that?
right.
The whole
So there's a distinction that can be made between what we call Torah from Sinai, right? That Moses receives on Mount Sinai the entire Torah, and Torah min hashamayim, Torah from heaven, which means, yes, it all comes from God, but it doesn't come in the same moment. And I would maintain, actually, that this idea of Torah from Sinai doesn't make a lot of sense for two reasons. First of all, because the Torah itself doesn't seem to read that way. In other words, what is revealed according to the Torah, if you just follow the text, is the 10 Commandments and Mishpatim, the laws thereafter, which seem to be a code to which the 10 Commandments are a preamble. But the other thing is this. Let's assume that this entire book is received at Sinai. So then Moses knows everything that's going to happen. He knows, for example, when he sends the scouts out to scout the land, they're going to bring back an evil report. The people are going to rebel. They're going to be stuck in the wilderness for an extra 40 years. He becomes an actor in a play, right? That seems completely untenable, that he should know everything that's going to happen and is stuck with these tragedies, one after another, and these rebellions, and has no choice but to play out this part. The rabbis want to grant the Torah the authority. The Torah doesn't claim this. The rabbis want to do it.
doesn't claim what?
The Torah doesn't claim it's all given at Sinai. Clearly,
doesn't it say that he went up the mountain for so many days and came down with that.
Right. So what Moses, whether or not, right? So what's he doing up there all that time?
Yeah.
Right. So Moses seems to be instructed in the law. Remember also that 40 is a number in Judaism, which in the Bible, which recurs again and again, right? It's a number which seems to reflect symbolically transitions. So the world is flooded for 40 days and 40 nights. The Israelites are 400 years in slavery. Moses is on the mountain, right, for 40 days and 40 nights. So it's hard to know how literally to take the number. I'm not saying that the rabbis don't have a basis for it, but I'm saying that it's very hard to accept if one simply looks at the meaning of the Torah in its context. Okay,
Doesn't that give an argument to the person who says the Torah is just a bunch of stories? It doesn't mean anything.
No,
It doesn't happen.
Because the claim here is not that the Torah doesn't come from God.
No, but the whole story of him being there and bringing down the Torah, they say it's a fable. So he can't say this is a fable.
No, that's not the claim. The claim is that Moses receives a revelation, he brings it down, right? It isn't complete, and it gets revealed over time, but it all has its origin in the divine. That's the claim, right? It's not, the only claim is whether we get it all in one place. And by the way, there are other laws that seem to be revealed. I mean, Torah explicitly tells us that certain things are revealed at Moab, right? Moses is teaching these and elsewhere as well. Now, biblical critics would say, well, all this really, the book of Deuteronomy comes during the reign of King Josiah, considerably later, right? And they want to account for this in terms of that. But I don't think you have to do that. Okay. Other questions?
Okay,
or
one
comments?
quickie.
Sandy and then Maureen. Go ahead, Sandy.
I think Maureen she had her hand up before, I'm sorry.
Maureen and then Sandy.
All right, it's a quick one. I just can't find in my text here what you were talking about with the ear.
With what? With the Jubilee year?
Ear,
Oh,
yeah.
the ear. Sure. Let me just, you look in verse 17. You should take an awl, put it through his ear at the doorpost.
Okay, wait a sec.
We're in chapter 15, and if you look at verse 17, you'll see it. Sandy.
Yeah, I just had a comment. So verse 14, thou shalt furnish him liberally as thy flock. And then,
Yeah.
and then 15, and thou shalt remember that thou wast the bondsman. It just reminds me of how when the Israelites were leaving, they got from their Egyptian neighbors the gold and
Yes,
silver.
very good, right? So there too, and thank you for mentioning that. So there's a parallel here. We don't go out empty-handed. In fact, we are liberally furnished with the wealth of Egypt. And here too, your slave should not go out empty-handed. And remember, in the case of the slave here, he has paid off his debt, right? So in some sense, he's not owed anything. But the Torah says that's beside the point. You have to make sure that he can live an independent life. Okay, so we're now getting to, Barry, did you have your hand out? Yeah, go ahead.
So it just occurred to me that not all debts are equal, but it seems like this 6 year.
So yes, no, I think you're quite right. And this is not saying that a slave must serve for 6 years. It's a maximum, not a minimum. Right. No matter how great the debt is, he still gets released in 6 years. Okay, anything else? Let's go back then. Let me change the view. Okay, we're going to look now at a regulation that has to do with the firstborn animals of a flock, which are consecrated to God, right? So if if you have, this takes place in the spring, generally, when animals are being born, and the firstlings of the herd and the flock, right, are consecrated to God. And therefore you must not work your firstling ox or shear your firstling sheep. You and your household eat it annually before the Lord your God in the place that the Lord will choose. So you're setting it aside. Just like the first harvest, a portion of that gets set aside. This is a recognition that it all comes from God. And because it all comes from God, we need to return a portion of it to God. And as we saw earlier, what does that mean? Well, it means that you either take it to Jerusalem where you enjoy it in the, in celebration in the place that God has chosen, or you turn it into money and you take the money and you go there and you buy it and then you can use it. And then we're going to get to a specific qualification. But if the animal has a defect, lameness, or blindness, any serious defect, you should not sacrifice it to the Lord your God. Eat it in your settlements, the impure among you no less than the pure, just like the gazelle and the deer. You must not partake of its blood. You should pour it out to the ground. So these things that you have permission to eat it where you are. You have no obligation. This is the Deuteronomic reform, right? That you don't offer sacrifices wherever you are. You have to go to Jerusalem. So these animals, you go to Jerusalem, but you can slaughter it and eat meat where you are. And here you can eat, if an animal is unsuitable because it has some sort of defect. It's unsuitable to give to God, but it's suitable for you to eat. There's no reason why you can't eat it, and it would be a real loss not to be able to eat it. I wanted to share with you something. This comes from the prophet Malachi, or Malachi, as he's called among those who don't know Hebrew. This comes from chapter 1, verse 6. And I want to actually now a son should honor his father, and a slave should show respect to his master. Now, if I am a father, says God, where is the honor due me? If I'm a master, where is the reverence due me? Says the Lord of hosts. O priests, you scorn my name, but you ask, how have we scorned your name? And then it goes on, when you present a blind animal for sacrifice, it doesn't matter. When you present a lame or sick one, it doesn't matter. Just offer it to your governor. Will he accept you? Will he show you favor? Says the Lord of hosts. And now implore the favor of God. Will he be gracious and accept us? This is what you have done. Will he accept you? Right? So here, the prophet Malachi is a prophet from the return of the Jewish people from their exile under the Babylonians. That's in 586. The Persians conquer the Babylonians. The exiles get to go home. They rebuild the temple. And in that temple, this is the second temple, the beginnings of the second temple. They once again can offer sacrifices. And the prophet Malachi says, look what they're doing, right? Do they think that this is what God wants? And he specifies the kind of animals that are here. And then goes on to make this claim. He says, if you gave that to your governor, would he be happy? Right? And from Malachi, we see perhaps a rationale for this law. The idea is to give God the best, not that which you don't really care to eat yourself. This reminds me also of the story of Cain and Abel, right? Cain is the first one, right? These are the first people to offer sacrifices. And Cain does it first. He seems to understand. He offers God a sacrifice. Abel, his brother, offers a sacrifice from the best of his crops. And Abel's sacrifice is accepted and Cain's sacrifice is not. And that, of course, leads to tragic consequences. But the idea here is that you give God the best, and therefore the animals should be without serious defect. And now we're come to the holidays. Couldn't be more relevant. As we're going to see, we begin with observe the month of Aviv. Now, Aviv, this is about Pesach. We observe Pesach in the month of Nisan, right? But that was not the original name of the month in the Bible. The name of the month of Nisan was Aviv. Aviv meaning spring. That was the title, the name of the month. And in the month of Aviv, offer a Passover sacrifice. Asita Pesach, make a Pesach. And the word Passover, of course, well known to us, right? And we even have this story because God passed over the houses of our ancestors when the angel of death comes and kills the firstborn among the Egyptians. The reason why it's translated, Pesach is translated as Passover, actually comes to us from Latin. comes from the Vulgate, which was the Latin translation. Pesach undoubtedly does not mean Passover. It's not a verb, a noun which is referring to the idea that the angel passed over the house. The word means protection, that they were protected from this calamity, this plague which comes upon the Egyptians. All right. It was in the month of Aviv at night, the Lord your God freed you from Egypt. You shall slaughter the Passover sacrifice for the Lord your God from the flock and the herd in the places which the Lord will choose to establish God's name. So Pesach now has to be celebrated where? In the temple. Of course, we wind up celebrating it. The temple is destroyed. We all do it in our homes, but we don't actually do a sacrifice. And I would mention the fact, you know how we come to point in the Passover Seder where we're fulfilling the idea that in every generation, a person should see themselves as they came out of Egypt, and whoever does not explain three things has not fulfilled their obligation on Pesach. What are those three things? Pesach, matzah, and moror, right? Pesach, talk about what that means in a minute, matzah and moror. So, and we point to the matzah and the maror, right? This matzah, which we eat, what is the reason? This matzah, this maror, this bitter herb that we eat, what is the reason? With Pesach, we simply say Pesach was eaten by our ancestors because what we have on the Seder plate is only a reminder of that sacrifice. But we don't eat the sacrifice anymore. But in the time of the temple, they did. And then it goes on, you should not eat anything leavened with it. For 7 days, you should eat unleavened bread. So the simple meaning of this text is that for 7 days, two things. You eat nothing with leavening in it, and you eat matzah. So the question is, do you have to eat matzah? And the rabbinic answer is only at the Seder, because the sacrifice was made together with matzah and. But even though it seems to say you eat bread for 7 days, rabbinic interpretation, using the rules of rabbinic interpretation, comes to the conclusion that you only have to eat matzah once, and that is at the Seder or outside the land of Israel, I guess twice, since we have two Sidurim. And here we get an expression for what the matzah is. Lechem oni, the bread of distress or the bread of affliction. And that's striking because and this is, of course, the language of the Haggadah, takes it from here, right? Lechem oni, bread of distress, bread of poverty is one way to translate it. And so the question is, why is it referred to as this, since it's really about bread of freedom, right? Our ancestors didn't have time to bake the loaves, so they did it quickly and they took it with them. So there are therefore traditions, well, they actually ate this in Egypt too. It was cheap, it was filling, it was good slave food. And I like that interpretation very much because it's the same stuff. In other words, matzah is both the bread of slavery and the bread of freedom. The difference between slavery and freedom is in some ways how you look at it, how you experience it, not the substance itself. You can be enslaved and still feel like a free person, and you can be a free person and so hemmed in by circumstance that you feel like a slave. For you departed from the land of Egypt early, so that you may remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt as long as you live. If you look at the Hebrew, kol yemei chayecha, all the days of your life. And this expression, of course, we know from the Haggadah. It's all the days of your life. Does that mean what does it say? All the days of your life, not just the days of your life. What interpretation? It's the nights as well as the days. Other interpretation, it's in this world and in the world to come. Even after the Messiah comes, we'll still celebrate Pesach. Okay. No leaven should be found with you in your territory, right? So this is not merely you don't eat it, it can't be with you, can't be in your house. And so we get stuck with this cleaning and everything else. In some ways, I feel like the celebration of Pesach is up to the moment of the Seder, we have to feel like slaves, because we have to do all of this very arduous work in order to prepare for the Seder. None of the flesh of what you slaughter in the evening shall be left until morning. You are not permitted to slaughter the Passover sacrifice in any of the settlements that the Lord your God is giving you, but at the place the Lord will choose to establish God's name. There alone will you slaughter it in the evening at sundown, the time of day when you departed from Egypt. You shall cook it and eat it in that place, and in the morning you may start back on your journey home, right? That is your journey home from Jerusalem as it becomes that place. After you have eaten it there, and then after eating unleavened bread for 6 days, you hold a solemn gathering on the seventh day. The word here, it says solemn gathering, but the word is atzeret. At the end of Pesach, you have an atzeret. That's it, which is another word for a holy day. Right? So we have one at the beginning, right, and one at the end. Of course, if you're outside the land of Israel, you have two at the beginning and two at the end. Right? So the word atzeret comes from the root atzor, which means to stop. Right? So this is the closing festival that closes out the holiday. And we have the same thing at Sukkot in the fall. And think about the name of the last day of Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, right? Which I remember it somewhere from my youth. Shmini Atzeret was translated in English, the 8th day closing festival. So that's the meaning of Atzeret, and that's why holidays of this type have an opening celebration and a closing celebration. And after that, we're going to go, I'm just going to go a little bit longer because it is what we're involved in here before we take questions. You shall count off 7 weeks. Start to count the 7 weeks when the sickle is first put to the standing grain. And then you will observe the Feast of Weeks. So we know this from Pesach. We have 7 weeks, and then at the end of 7 weeks, we celebrate Shavuot, which is literally, if you look at the Hebrew in verse 10, Chag Shavuot, the holiday of Shavuot. Why is it called Shavuot? Because we have counted off 7 Shavuot, 7 weeks. So it is the holiday of weeks. So according to this, it is really in the book of here, as earlier, Shavuot is a harvest festival, right? This is a period of harvest which begins with Pesach and now will conclude with Shavuot right before the rains fall and you can't harvest anymore. The period in between is the period of the Omer. We're in the period of the Omer, and actually today is a very significant day in the Omer period. Today is Lag BaOmer, which is the 33rd day of the Omer. There's a tradition that there was a plague among the students of Rabbi Akiva, and during this period, and that plague lifted on the 33rd day of the Omer. So it becomes a day of celebration. Otherwise, the period of the Omer is, by rabbinic understanding, not biblically, it's a period of partial mourning. Weddings are not held during this period, according to some, during the entire period, according to others, beginning with the Rosh Chodesh after Pesach to the end. And the prevailing custom, at least in America, among Ashkenazic Jews, is that you don't have weddings up to Lag BaOmer, up to today. After today, you can have weddings up till Shavuot. I'm struck by the fact in the synagogue that I go to now, at the end of the service, the rabbi announces anniversaries for that week. He wishes happy birthday to people, right? But up till now, from Pesach, there have been no anniversaries to announce, right? Because Jews didn't get married during this period. I suspect that next Shabbat and thereafter, there may well be anniversaries announced. So it says you should count 7 weeks. And we could just see this as, yeah, wait till 7 weeks have gone by, but the tradition has seen this as an obligation to count off 7 weeks and actually to do it out loud, right? To say, this is the first day of the Omer, which we say on the evening after the first day of Pesach, and to continue to count until the 49th day of the Omer, that is until Erev Shavuot. And we not only count the days, but since it says you should count off 7 weeks, after we come to the end of the first week, we say, today is the 7th day of the Omer, which is 1 week in the counting of the Omer. Today is the 14th day of the Omer, or today is the 8th day, which is 1 week and 1 day. Today is the 9th, 1 week and 2 days, and so on. All of that to kind of literally fulfill this, after which we have this holiday of Shavuot, where you should rejoice before the Lord your God, your son, your daughter, your male and female slave, the Levite in your community, the stranger, the fatherless, the widow in your midst, the place the Lord your God will choose. Notice, no celebration is complete unless everybody gets to celebrate. You, your slaves, widows, the orphans, you have an obligation to make sure that everybody celebrates. And the Torah is mindful of the fact that not everybody has the means to celebrate. So you have to make it happen. And again, bear in mind that you were slaves in Egypt and take care to obey these laws. We're gonna stop here because we're almost out of time. We haven't quite made it to Sukkot, and that's where we will pick up next time. But I do want to open things up for final questions, comments about the holidays. Hannah, go ahead. Yeah, unmute. And
I'm so glad we talked about this today. That was my bat mitzvah portion, but I never dealt with the meaning of it, actually. So it was really good to know. However,
right.
You said you spoke about the word Pesach, that it doesn't mean passed over. I mean, it's a verb in Hebrew. It means to pass over.
It
Did
does
it mean
not.
saved?
It doesn't mean to pass over.
Does not?
No.
That's what I checked in the dictionary today too. That's
yeah. I know. But biblical scholars will tell you that in biblical Hebrew, that's not what it meant. And what we are, I'll give you another example of the same thing. What did Adam and Eve eat in the Garden of Eden?
Manna.
No, in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, an apple, right? No, they ate the apple. No, that's the Vulgate. That's the Latin translation, is that it's an apple. And there's a reason, because the word apple and the word sin are very similar in Latin. But actually, all that's specified in the Torah itself is that they ate a fruit that came from this tree. And therefore, the rabbis spend a lot of time speculating over what fruit this is, why. And so one answer is that it was an etrog, right? That fruit, that citron that we eat that we don't eat, that we wave on the holiday of Sukkot. And there are other answers that are given as well. So part of what we've inherited is based not on the Hebrew itself, but on the Latin translation of the Hebrew. We also have an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew, and there exists in a Greek translation of the Hebrew. The Aramaic translation is called the Targum. That also has some interesting, these translations are more common, all translations in a sense are commentaries, right? They all force reading one way or another. And here's a classic example of that. How does the book of Genesis begin? Bereshit bara Elohim, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. Something God, the heaven and created the heaven and the earth. Well, following King James, the classic translation is, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. If you look in our Chumash here, following the Jewish Publication Society translation, when God began to create the heaven and the earth. Different, right? If I say in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, then nothing came before, right? If I say when God began to create the heaven and the earth was unformed and void, it leaves open the question of, was there anything? So these translations, and it's very hard to translate the words Bereshit bara, in the beginning of creating, or one way of translating it would be Berishonah, in the beginning, but it doesn't say Berishonah, it says Bereshit. Anyway, the point is, translations are, by their nature, interpretation. And so the Vulgate, Pesach, Passover, doesn't seem to be the basic meaning of the Hebrew. And I wonder if that's even here in the note. Let me just go back to Pesach. It may or may not be. Yeah, if you look, it's actually in the notes on the page 1081. It says exactly what I said. In the Vulgate, the verb appears, the Lord passed over, the sacrifice is called Passover. The Hebrew word, however, does not mean Passover. Most of the ancient translations and commentaries render the verb as the Lord spared, had compassion, or protected. The sacrifice accordingly is called the protective sacrifice, referring to the protections of the Israelites during the final plague. I've read studies of this where they really analyze the Hebrew, and there's another word which means Passover, but let's leave it at that. Other questions about these holidays or the firstlings of flocks or anything? Francesca.
Hi, 1 second, let me lower this thing. So two things. So first, Rabbi Ornstein's daughters, well, one of the daughters is Aviva. So does that mean her name is Spring?
Yes.
Translate it? That's the only Aviva I know.
Yes, Aviva, which is actually a fairly common Hebrew name.
Was it?
Yeah. Is spring. You know, a lot of Hebrew names have natural meanings.
I know.
Elon means tree, or Ilana. So yeah, I'm not aware of other seasons Like the summer is Stav. I don't know anybody's named Stav, or Choref for winter, but Aviv. And you can see it, right? The spring is such a happy
Oh, sure. Life is coming back.
Yeah. And you said you had something else as well?
Yes. Why is it we're not supposed to marry during this period? You
All
just
right,
sort of
see,
glanced over
right,
that part. You just said we're not supposed to do it.
So it is viewed as a period of partial mourning.
Oh,
A variety of explanations are given. One, because there was this plague among the students of Rabbi Akiva. So I once studied with Moshe Greenberg, who was one of the really predominant biblical scholars of the 20th century, who suggested that this was a period of great anxiety as you're preparing to bring in the harvest and things can go wrong. And so this kind of mourning came out of this agricultural anxiety. I don't know, but it is viewed,
good theory.
it is viewed that way.
Okay,
Anybody else? Sandy, go ahead.
So Rabbi, I'm not sure if I learned this from you but somewhere along the line about, like if there's an event that you're looking forward to, like a graduation or a birthday, you have a countdown, like 10 more days, 9 more
Yes.
days. So
Yes.
here with the Omer, it's reverse in the sense that you're counting how many days there have been, but the end goal is, getting the Torah, receiving the Torah. So that's the exciting part.
Yes, yes. But there's a sort of message there, right? That when you're counting up, you just want the days to disappear. Right? I can't wait. I want to say one more thing about this, and this is not biblical, but it perhaps is implicit. Shavuot is, according to rabbinic tradition, the day of the giving of the Torah. It is not described that way here, right? It's just an agricultural festival. The rabbis calculate, based on the description of the Exodus, that it must have been Shavuot, and so it becomes that. And once we see Shavuot as the time of the giving of the Torah, then what we have with the counting of the Omer is a linkage between Pesach, which celebrates freedom, and the giving of the Torah, which is really about responsibility. It's what we are required to do as we have been freed. And the idea is that you can't really have freedom without responsibility, that freedom doesn't mean the license to do whatever you want to do. And I think that's particularly an important message right now in our country, because people say, for example, I don't want to, thank God the pandemic is now at a manageable stage where it's not even a pandemic, but people were saying, I won't get inoculated, I don't want to wear a mask, even in places where I seem to be required. Why? Because freedom. Right? But the problem with that kind of freedom is it has consequences for other people. Right? And so this notion that freedom simply means license to do whatever you want to do is contradicted here. As we say that there is no freedom without responsibility. Okay. Yeah, one more thing. We're over time. Go ahead.
Are you giving this sermon this Shabbat at your synagogue?
I am actually giving a sermon in B'nai Shalom this Shabbat. Those who you can see it, it's Congregation B'nai Shalom in West Orange. It is on their YouTube channel, yeah, I'm looking forward to doing it. I would also mention, for those who came later, I am extending this class by 2 weeks. And so for those who can join, the last day of the class for this season will be June 6th. And on that note, I want to wish you a great week. Look forward to seeing you next week. I'm going to just now end the, where is it?